Hi, welcome. This is an introduction to philosophy where we explore some of the ultimate questions that philosophers ask. My name is Mark Thorsby, and today we're going to be talking about this question: do our ideas shape reality? And we're talking about Kant's Copernican turn, at least that's the title for the lecture. In terms of the specificity, we're actually looking at Kant's a sort of basic general sense of Kant's Transcendental Idealism. So anyway, welcome back everyone. I hope you guys are doing well. So we're starting today with what I'm calling Kant's Copernican turn. And I sort of, if you'll see, I have a little planet here, right? And there's a picture of the sun, or sun behind the earth here as my sort of opening window here. And the reason I want to do that is because I want to draw your attention to Copernicus. Thus far in the semester, we've been talking about the different ways in which the rationalist and the empiricist understand the world. And then we took something of a detour and began to look at how consciousness can be understood. And we looked at Thomas Nagel's essay, for instance. Well, today we're returning back to this question about the role between innate ideas on the one hand and the idea that our knowledge comes from experience on the other, right? And we're going to see that, if we will, we can understand that as a pre-Copernican view in philosophy, right? Copernicus was the scientist, an astronomer who articulated that the Earth was actually revolving around the sun. And that created a revolution in science. And in the same way, Kant's philosophy here, and his Copernican turn, has just as an enormous impact in the history of philosophy. But here's the thing I'll tell you, is that Kant's philosophy is incredibly dense. It's very difficult to understand, not because Kant is not a good writer, but because Kant is trying to articulate something that is very difficult to articulate at all. And what he's going to do is that, we'll get into this in a moment, but what you're going to see is he's going to invent a sort of new vocabulary for organizing and understanding how it is we have knowledge, right? And it's going to require it's going to require an analysis of consciousness ultimately, but we'll see it's not phenomenological per se, so we're not going to be talking about intentionality or anything like that. Well, anyway, let's get going here, and let's jump right into it. The first thing I want you to do, though, is pause this video if you haven't already, and I'd like you to watch Henry Markram's TED Talk on trying to build a brain within a supercomputer. Here's the URL. I encourage you to pause this and watch that video. I'm going to be talking about that video as a reference point, which I'm hoping can help us understand what Kant's trying to talk about when he talks about our a priori judgments. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But if you can, watch this video, and then we'll jump right into it, okay? Okay, now we're moving on here. So the first thing I want to sort of draw your attention to here is a little bit about the life of Immanuel Kant. I better zoom in here. He was born in 1724 and he died in 1804. He lived his entire life in Königsberg, Prussia. Now, it's interesting, he's one of the few and really sort of the first major philosopher within the history of philosophy to actually have been a university professor. In 1755, he worked as a private docent at the University of Königsberg. But he was also one of the first, he lectured around 21 hours a week on a whole range of topics. He didn't just teach philosophy per se. He taught geography, anthropology, ethics, logic, even courses on race. Now, Kant has been heavily criticized as of late for his discussion of race, but it's interesting. You may want to look it up. But the guy lectured on a whole range of things. I think geography was his favorite. But in 1770, he was appointed to a permanent position as a professor of logic and mathematics. And he worked there for really the rest of his life. And in his late 50s, he published probably what is probably one of the most important works in philosophy, really since probably David Hume's work, called The Critique of Pure Reason. Now, Kant's sort of overall project can be understood in three different sort of categories. On the one hand, he writes The Critique of Pure Reason, which is his answer to a whole range of questions that we have yet to ask, but that concern David Hume's, ultimately his empiricism that leads to sort of that leads in a skeptical direction. So that's The Critique of Pure Reason, is how analyzes how is it, or what are the principles upon which reason rests. so that if we can understand those, we might be able to understand why, for instance, science and cause and effect relations can be believed. In the second major work, he publishes the critique of judgment. I'm sorry, of practical reason. And the critique of practical reason contains fundamentally his ethical system. We'll be talking about his ethics later in the course, but we'll be referencing not the critique of practical reason. We'll be talking about the groundwork to the metaphysics of morals, which is a great place to begin your discussion with Kant's ethics. And of course, he also has a critique of judgment, which is his analysis of aesthetics, and it has actually large implications in terms of science. And there's also the Prolegomena to a future metaphysics, and that's what I'm having you read this week. So if you want to sort of stick up with the reading, I want you to go and download that, the Prolegomena, and I want you to read the first couple sections. And then he also writes, one of my favorite works is he writes on political philosophy, including an essay called On Perpetual Peace. And my favorite actually is an essay of his called An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment?, in which he articulates a view of anti-paternalism, which I think is fairly fascinating. So Kant wrote a lot, but his impact is enormous, and the most impact he had probably is in the critique of pure reason. So that's the first sort of thing. So let's sort of jump into it. One of the things I think is helpful when we talk about Kant is to sort of give my students a framework for understanding why Kant is writing what he is. And as a note, let me also say is that this video, I'm giving you a basic sort of kind of crash course in Kant's Transcendental Idealism, but that is no substitute for actually walking through step by step Kant's actual arguments. Okay, so I just want to say that at the get-go, you should read Kant. Not simply rely on this video for your understanding, because this is meant to give you the crash course. But anyway, what are his main goals? He writes, I freely admit that, this is from I think the second publication of the Critique of Pure Reason. In the preface he writes, I freely admit that it was the remembrance of David Hume, who many years ago first interrupted my dogmatic slumber and gave me investigations in the field of speculative philosophy, a completely different direction. So, and let's remind ourselves what David Hume's sort of project was. And in particular, I want to draw your attention and remind you of his analysis of cause and effect relations. If you'll recall, in David Hume's Epistemology, he argues that things that cannot be traced, in principle at least, to a simple impression should not be believed as an article of knowledge, right? You need a simple impression, because if all knowledge comes from experience, right? If you remember David Hume, he's an empiricist. So if all knowledge comes from experience, then that means all experience is given to me in the form of impressions, Hume argues. And then we can have simple as well as complex impressions, but ultimately the simple impression is the atomic element of our experience. And if we're ever going to say we know something about the world, then we have to be able to trace back whatever it is we think we know to that simple impression. And so, but as a result, when he analyzes cause and effect, right? And when I say cause and effect, I have a hot tea here, right? If I drop the hot tea, I may burn my leg. So and most of us would say, right, if you saw me, for instance, at the hospital, and you said, what's wrong with you, Professor Thorsby? I would say, I burned my leg. And you would say, how did that happen? And I would say, the tea. But I would mean that the tea has a necessary connection to the event of my leg burning, right? And so we have this view of cause and effect relations between objects in the world, and by that we mean a necessary connection between the events we're experiencing. But the problem, Hume said, is that there is no simple impression of causation itself. There's a simple impression of my leg being burned, right? Oh, there's a simple impression of the coffee cup. And there's a whole range of simple impressions, but none of those, in the experience of me dropping it and burning my leg, do I actually perceive causation, a necessary connection. And so Hume reduced causal events to what he called the category of constant conjunction of events, right? We just see them over and over and over again, and so we presume that there's a necessity that laces through all of these events we experience. But ultimately, the presumption is not a category of knowledge. And so ultimately Hume suggests that we don't have knowledge of cause and effect. Now, what is the huge, overwhelming impact of that analysis? It's number one is science, right? Number one is because science depends, and I'm thinking of the physical and material sciences here, and well, maybe all sciences actually, they depend on cause and effect relations, right? The physicist does experiments, right, to yield results, and they try to falsify those results through hypotheses and testing, but they're trying to see if they can figure out what really causes something to happen in another body, right? So, for instance, think of physicians studying antibiotics, right? We want to understand how exactly the antibiotics cause the disease to die or wither, right? We don't want to just know that when you do this, it tends to be the case that you'll get better, right? We want to know for sure. So the goal of science is knowledge, and it's about knowledge of the material world. And that material world, of course, has a sort of range, of fabric of causal relations. But Hume essentially annihilated that category. So one of the first major goals of Kant here is to protect science, to find firmer philosophical footing, to argue that it's not simply a correlation, a series of correlations that, for instance, experimentation should yield, but actual knowledge of the necessity between them, right? The next sort of question here is freedom, and that's in his ethics, right? He wants to protect the notion of autonomy and freedom. He's well known, for instance, for the principle of autonomy in medical ethics, in which ultimately a patient should have the right to determine what happens to them, right? That's part of Kant's impact in ethics, but that's because he wants to protect autonomy. But in order to do that, he has to understand exactly how the human mind cognizes the world, because otherwise an account of freedom is a fool's errand. And finally, he's interested in protecting God. And I have to be a bit careful here, Kant is, I would say, something of a sort of secular theist in my own view. I mean, he considered himself a Christian, I believe. And he's interested in protecting God as a category, or I shouldn't say God, but he's interested in protecting faith. That's probably the better term there, not God, but faith. Because he wants to argue that people who have faith are not crazy, right? And the way he wants to do that is to say that, well, we can't disprove God, so neither can we prove God's existence, but that means there is a realm of potential rationability. Thus, it makes sense to have faith in God, or at least one could. So he's interested in that. We won't be talking about that at all throughout the term, but if you're interested in this, you can read his book, Religions Within the Boundary of Mere Reason. Okay, so let's sort of move forward here. The other thing, the way I want you to understand Kant here is to understand him as a synthesis between rationalism on the one hand and empiricism on the other. Remind ourselves, and again, I have to stress that these sorts of stock ways of understanding Kant are insufficient ultimately. You should actually read the Critique of Pure Reason to get the play-by-play. But rationalism, again, was this idea that is this position in epistemology, right, that argued that some things can only be known through reason, right? And empiricism was the idea that all knowledge must come through experience, right? However one defines that experience. And we saw Hume, of course, defining it as a simple impressions and so forth, right? Of course, the story is more complicated, but what I want you to see here, Kant is bringing together aspects of each of these. Kant is not going to deny that our knowledge of the world requires experience of the world, but he's also going to argue that we might have something like innate ideas, not ideas per se, but innate categories of perception. And he wants to pull this together, and today it's often referred to as a transcendental idealism. And hopefully, when you watch the Henry Markram talk, I want you to sort of remember that, for instance, Henry Markram argues, he calls it a perceptual bubble, right? And we're going to see that Kant wants to say that there's categories of perception upon which our perceptual bubble builds, but it's never activated until we begin to have experience. So But before I sort of get in there, we're going to talk a little bit more about Henry Markram in a moment. I want to mention the myth of the given. There's a philosopher by the name of Wilfrid Sellars who wrote a great text on this topic called The Myth of the Given. And I want to use that as a way of saying that, remember, if we're going to say that Kant has a Copernican turn, that means that he's going to fundamentally shift the axis upon which we analyze our cognition, right? And just as a reminder, remember Locke's model of the mind, right? Where he said that there's two movements in the mind, right? So, for instance, here's the example: you get a birthday present for your birthday, right? You go somehow the light waves fly into your eyeball, right? But then inside your mind, right? Somehow your brain takes the particles of sensation or whatever, and organize them into a representation, literally a representation of the present in your head, right? So literally, so what that meant though for Locke was that all knowledge of the world, because the world's out here, was always indirect, right? Because it's always, if you will, sort of has to be organized through the levers of perception, or how the levers of the mind, whatnot. And in a certain way, we're going to see that the myth of the given here, Kant is going to essentially argue that, wait a second, this model of the mind is what we have to overcome, right? Because notice it's always directional, right? I see the coffee cup and the impression comes to me, it's somehow organized. In this view, right, the mind is seen as a passive receptacle, right? Almost something like a sponge. I just sort of soak up experience. Think of Locke's term, tabula rasa, a blank slate. There, right, Locke's idea was that the mind was just sort of open to impressions. But wait a second, what if the mind doesn't work like that? And you just watched the Henry Markram talk, and I want to remind you that he says 99% of what we see does not come in through the eyes. Right? He says it's actually what our mind infers about our perception. Right? So there's a sort of kind of break between the world and our perception. We're going to see that Kant ultimately has to agree that there is a break between our perception of the world. But what we're going to see is that the sort of kind of arrows are going to flip. So it's sort of very much like Copernicus. We're changing the axis of our entire explanation. So let's move forward here. That's, I think, a helpful way. So, because the idea here is that there's this myth that ultimately experience is just given to me whole cloth and I just passively receive it. That's a myth. So what's Kant's view of the mind, right? Well, here, I don't want to. Kant's view of the mind, I like to show you this. Kant's view of the mind is that the mind is active, not passive. So you can see in the video here, right, the mind sort of takes perception and organizes it. And Kant's argument was that objects conform to reason, right? Objects conform to reason, not the other way around, right? It's not that the mind is just passively receiving, but the mind is sort of shooting out, jutting out into the world and organizing my perceptions. And we're going to see what Kant wants to understand is what are the laws that govern that organization of the mind. Now, notably, this is before Kant, no one had really, if someone had thought of this, no one had articulated it as such, right? At least not to the specificity that we see with Kant. So here, the first principle is that the mind is active, not passive. Okay, the second point here is that, I'm sort of skipping around a little bit, my apologies, is that objects conform to reason, right? Hume's view was that we have experience of objects, and then with that experience, we sort of build up our reasons, right? That's sort of kind of how his whole system was, because the ideas were always a consequence first of a simple impression or a complex impression potentially, but always an impression. So in Hume's view, reason had to conform to the objects of perception, right? Or you might say that the objects of perception for Hume were the delimiting factor for reason, for how effective reason can be. But we're going to see part of this Copernican turn here is that our objects conform to reason. And so the idea here is that our reason is organizing the objects of our perception. And this will become very, very important because it means that if this is the case universally, a critique of pure reason, right, will render us an understanding of how objects universally do conform in perception, right? So the critique of pure reason is really about sort of understanding the laws that govern the mind's ability to understand and cognize the world, right? But the first point is that the objects don't do the work; the mind does the work. So here, this is not from Kant, but this is my sort of way I like to understand it, is that consciousness, therefore, is a matrix which manipulates and organizes the manifolds of perception, right? Consciousness, so when we're conscious of, I gotta show this since I love it, when consciousness sees the world, it organizes all of this stuff, right? And Henry Markram's project here is so interesting because he's ultimately trying to see if the brain has the physical capacity to do such a thing. And so it'll be very interesting to see what his final results will be, right? But I think that he sort of demonstrates that consciousness here may be this matrix that organizes how we perceive the world, right? And of course, Kant is trying to do this without any brain science. Now, remember, we also talked about Nagel in a previous video, and the idea there was that the mind can't be simply reduced to physicalism, or at least not in a comprehensible sense. So I'm still suspicious here that the brain is nothing, that our consciousness, our minds are nothing other than the brain, but we'll sort of hold on with that. Now let's talk about Kant's framework. What I want to do is sort of lay down a series of ideas for you to understand. The first thing here is I want to talk about the difference between what Kant calls the noumenon and the phenomenon. The noumenon, or the noumenal, right? The noumenon refers to objects in themselves, right? And the phenomenon refers to objects as perceived, right? So the first thing we have to understand is that if we try to make an entire category of knowledge, right? We could talk about noumenal knowledge, that would be knowledge about things in themselves. And then on the other hand, we could talk about knowledge where we talk about things as they're perceived. Now, as human beings, this category of the noumenal is unknown to us, right? I can never know what it's like for the coffee cup to be a coffee cup. That's really an absurd position, right? I only know the coffee cup in the sense that I do perceive it as a coffee cup. So, knowledge, at least all human knowledge, is always phenomenal. Right? There is no noumenal knowledge that is possible. That's what I meant when I said that Kant ultimately still has to maintain the idea that we can talk about perception, we can talk about the present on its own, right? The present in and of itself is noumenal and it can't be known. But the present as phenomenal can be known, right? So that means that Kant is interested in building up an understanding of how that works, or understanding of the phenomenal, because reason organizes the phenomenal, and so he wants to understand exactly what the rules are for that sort of process to take place. Now, he calls this a transcendental investigation, or transcendental philosophy. And I'm sort of the phenomenological school that interprets this as saying that ultimately, and I think this is right, is that that he's interested in understanding what must necessarily be the case, such that our perception exists as it does, right? So the transcendental, you can think transcendent means beyond. So he wants to sort of understand what is the fabric of our minds beyond our experience that must govern our experience, right? And that's a transcendental investigation, or he also refers to it as a transcendental metaphysics. If you'll recall, at the beginning of the semester, I defined metaphysics as an investigation into what must necessarily be the case such that the world is as it is. Here, I've given you the same sort of understanding, except I'm talking about perception rather than the world, okay? Now, let's jump in here to probably one of the most important terms that's necessary to understand Kant, is the distinction between a priori and a posteriori. Now, we have talked about this previously, so hopefully you recall. A priori refers to before experienced, and a posteriori, post, after, it means knowledge after experience, right? So, for instance, when we looked at the a priori first, right, we could say that last time we talked about Anselm's argument for God's existence, his ontological argument, as an a priori argument. And what we meant by that is that that Anselm's argument can be understood, right, if it can be understood, without making any reference to the world or to our experience of the world. Right? It was purely a conceptual argument. Whereas the other arguments for God's existence we looked at, we said were all a posteriori, because Aquinas begins with an analysis of our experience in an Aristotelian framework in order to make his sort of argument. So this distinction is really, really important, right? The a priori versus the a posteriori. The second thing is we have to also make a distinction between intuitions and judgments, right? Now, an intuition, I want you to understand an intuition as essentially the sort of snapshot of our experience, right? So intuition here for Kant doesn't refer to that I have sort of a sixth sense that the burglar is going to steal the money or something. It's not to some sixth sense. Intuition for Kant refers to how my mind wraps itself into experience. That's not a very good term here, but it refers to the idea that how my mind meets the world and organizes that experience. So we can talk about an analysis of intuition, right, can yield some of the laws for pure reason. Now, a judgment, by contrast, the difference between intuition and judgment is a judgment is when I say something is the case. So knowledge or epistemology is about the category of our judgments, right, ultimately. My intuition, because for instance, imagine if I go to see a magician performs a card trick, right? I have the intuition, I have the sort of experience, my consciousness sort of organizes my experience in such the way that I think that literally the Statue of Liberty is gone. But of course, that's different from making the judgment that it really is gone, right? So think of intuition here as an experiential category, and think of judgment here as an epistemological category, okay? So we have the a priori, the a posteriori. Now, the next thing I've got to talk about here, and this is a little bit confusing, is the distinction Kant makes between the analytic judgments and synthetic judgments. So what does this mean? Well, analytic judgments are those in which the connection of the predicate is thought through identity, right? So because here, first off, remember every sentence has a subject and a predicate. So for instance, every statement I should say, here is for instance an example. Imagine if I say all bodies are extended. So bodies here is the subject and extended is the predicate. And predicate means I'm just predicating a characteristic or quality to the subject, right? So if I say the grass is green, I'm saying that whatever this object is, greenness applies, right? And so, but what Kant's saying here is that when you have a relationship between two terms here, in which they're actually understood in terms of they're identical, right? Because all bodies are extended. Anything that has a body per se, like a coffee cup, is extended in space, right? We precisely say that the mind is not the body, if you will, because it's not extended, or at least we don't know what is extended. The body is what's extended, right? So to say that all bodies are extended, this is an analytic judgment that's actually known through an identical relation between bodies and extension on the other hand, okay? Now, synthetic judgments, though, are those statements which are known without identity. So those statements where the subject and the predicate are not identical, right? So for instance, if I say all bodies are heavy, well, just because something has extension in space doesn't mean it's heavy, right? For instance, think about the air that's all around you, right? We don't, at least in a typical sense, call them heavy. We say that the air is light, right? Now, I don't want to get into debate about whether air is light or not, but you can see here, heaviness is not identical with extension, right? Or bodiness, right? So that's the first sort of thing to recognize. So that means we make two distinct types of judgments, right? We have our analytic judgments. Those are judgments where the subject and the predicate are essentially identical, like all triangles have three sides. And I have synthetic judgments, right? These are judgments where I say, for instance, the grass is green, or the weather is cold, or whatever, right? And so the grand majority, actually, of our judgments are actually synthetic. In fact, Kant says that all judgments of experience are synthetic, right? Because think about it, every time I experience something, right? If I want to make a judgment about them, I have to pull together ideas because experience occurs sequentially over time, right? So that means that anytime I make a judgment about my experience, I'm synthesizing different objects, right? So all the judgments of experience are actually synthetic, but we can talk about synthetic a priori judgments. I'm sorry, not. Well, here, let me do this. I'm going to move ahead here. Sorry. I want to move here to the categories because I think this is the easiest way we can understand it. Okay, so the first thing I want to sort of say here is that we now have these four different ideas. We have the analytic on the one hand, we have the synthetic on the other, we have the a priori and the a posteriori. And what I want you to do is to create a table, right? And we can say that each one of these squares represents a category or a domain of knowledge, right? So let's start down here because I think this is the easy. So this would be the synthetic a posteriori. Kant says all judgments of our experience are here. So if I say that the tree is finally growing the leaves, right? That's a judgment about the world. I've synthesized perception together, right? So all knowledge, all my judgments about experience are in this category, right? Now let's talk about the analytic a posteriori. Now, the analytic a posteriori, let me move in here. Kant says that, because remember, an analytic a posteriori judgment would be a judgment after experience, right? And it would be a judgment known through its own identity, right? And Kant says he says it would be absurd to found an analytic judgment on experience. Since in forming the judgment, I must not go outside of my concept, there's no need to appeal to the testimony of experience in its support, right? He doesn't think there is any a posteriori analytic judgments. He thinks it's absurd. It's crazy. Why? Because all judgments of experience are automatically synthetic, right? But guess what? Now that was Kant's view. There's a whole field of philosophers who, while we can understand Kant's argument here, I want to understand this fourth one as a description of a certain category of knowledge. Oops, there's a little spelling error there. So I want you to understand it as a category of knowledge, okay? Which we can just put an X in. We don't experience the world with this because how could we have an identity of something we haven't experienced? It doesn't make any sense. Now, but where it gets interesting, here's where I really want to focus is right here with Kant's, with the question of the analytic a priori. And the analytic a priori is where Kant places what's known as the transcendental aesthetic. So what is the transcendental aesthetic? I'm going to give you this here. Right? The analytic, we're talking about analytic a priori judgments. So now what we're talking about are judgments of known only through themselves, right? Because they are identical, the subjects and the predicate, right? And these are analytics, so they're only known only through themselves, and it's before experience. So here you'd have to imagine, well, whatever falls in this category has to be something that's before experience, and yet I somehow know it necessarily through itself, right? That seems bizarre. But his argument here is going to be, no, it's not actually. He's talking about space and time, right? The transcendental aesthetic is the pure a priori intuition. He talks about in the Critique of Pure Reason. But here's the thing: think about space for a moment. Have any of us ever experienced space itself? Well, no. But I don't mean space itself in the noumenal sense. I mean it in the phenomenal sense. Have any of us experienced space? No, we experience objects in space. And if we experience objects in space, then that means space must be one of the ways that my perception is organizing my understanding, right? In the Henry Markram talk, he gives an example of the moon. He says the moon why is it that the moon looks so big, right, when it's actually small, right? If you could draw a little line, it's only this big or something in your field of perception. Why does it look so big? Because your mind's inferring that spatiality, right? But you don't actually see or experience the space itself phenomenally. You see rather all objects through space, right? So space is not a property of things in the world, but the subjective condition for sensibility. Right? It's necessary for us to have any sensation, and any sensation of the external world. Time, right? Time is the necessary a priori ground for all intuitions. Now, because remember, Kant thinks that our intuitions occur sequentially, right? Think of your experience for a moment. You started this video, and you could even imagine the sort of kind of little thing at the bottom that's moving on the video screen, right? Where it shows where you're at. Each one of these consists of frames per second, right? And all of this is occurring sequentially. And this sequentiality, right? You don't experience time as such. You always experience objects or intuitions sequentially, which means that time is not experienced as such. It is rather the matrix which organizes my intuitions, right? So space and time are not in the world, right? Space and time are rather the sort of projection rules that I use for my mind to build its sort of perceptual bubble, right? And he calls this the transcendental aesthetic. Why? Because you can't reduce space any further. Space and time is far conceptually as reduced as possible, right? Time is not the same thing as space, and neither is space-time, but they're somehow both happening simultaneously in our experiences of the world. And so, since they're irreducible, they're a priori ideal categories, right? So the idea here is he has an idealism where the mind is organizing my perceptions, and space and time, it refers to right, are my analytic a priori judgments. Now, where it's most important, and this is where I sort of want to really hit on, is well, actually, let me go back here, is the synthetic a priori. So here we're talking about things that are known, right, before experience, but they are synthetic. That is, somehow they're not known through the subjects and the predicates being an identity. They're not identical terms, right? And here's where Kant brilliantly answers Hume's problem. And this right here is the sort of core of the Copernican turn, I think, to some degree, right? And this is the table of the categories, the synthetic a priori categories, right? So here the idea is that Kant thinks that we have these laws that are not irreducible like space and time, but somehow they're given to me in my perception of the world, or rather, they're necessary for what is given to me in my perception. And for instance, he talks about quantity, unity, plurality, totality, quality, reality, negation, limitation. Reality is an interesting one, right? Think about, for instance, a couple weeks ago, I think we talked about Nojik's experience machine, right? And the question was, would you be willing to live a complete, virtual reality for your whole life if you could have anything you want? And the idea was that most people say no because it's not real. But do you have a simple impression of what's real and what's not? The answer is no, you don't. So how is it that we make this distinction? Well, Hume sort of thought it was vivacity, but that wasn't good enough. The answer for Kant here is that it's a synthetic a priori category, or a law, we might even say, which organizes my perception. It's one of these manifolds necessary, or one of these elements that's necessary for the manifolds of my perception. Same thing with negation, right? And think back here, going all the way back to the beginning of the semester, to Parmenides. When we read Parmenides, we discovered that Parmenides argued that nothingness doesn't make any sense, and so nothingness can't be real. So if nothingness isn't real, then that means there's no such thing as difference or space or time or anything, right? There was this ultimate sort of kind of, universal claim, right? Where all things are one, right? But we see here with Kant here, negation, my ability to see space, and space is different, but my ability to see nothingness is somehow involved in my synthetic a priori tuition, right? He also talked about of relations and of modality. And I'm not going to go through all of these because that's not really the point for today's lesson. What I want you to really focus on is this, of causality and dependence, of cause and effect, right? So here the idea is that, okay, so Hume is right in the sense that there is no simple impression, right, of the billiard ball hitting the other ball, as we had shown in our video when we did Hume, right? Or me burning my leg with my coffee, right? So there's no simple impression of cause and effect, of the necessary connection between events, but my experience is such that my intuitions naturally organize my understanding through a relation of causality and dependence. The idea that some events depend on other things, and and that these things are necessary. And so here the idea is that cause and effect is not necessary, is not in the world. It's not an object in the world. It's rather one of the rules by which we use to understand or have knowledge about our world. Right? It's one of the ways we manipulate and organize our perception of these sorts of raw objects. Right? The world is not given to me in this sense of just sort of perceptual impressions. Rather, my mind meets the world and rearranges it in a way, not if it rearranges, but it arranges it in such a way. And because think about it, if I took away cause and effect, right, think of your ordinary intuition. This is one of the problems with David Hume's treatise here, right? It's because Hume argued that there can't be causality, but yet we somehow still have to treat our lives as if there were. Excuse me. And he didn't know how to do that. But here we have an answer. The answer is that when we understand causality as part of the perceptual matrix, if you will, then we can understand that science does make sense because it's true we don't have noumenal knowledge, but who cares, right? Because we're only experiencing the world as ourselves, and so nothing seems to be lost per se, or at least if there were, we would never know. And so the idea is that we have this phenomenal knowledge, and phenomenal knowledge is given or exists with a sort of a category of relation, causality and dependence that organizes my perception. And so with this, we have a way of actually protecting science all of a sudden, right? Because now we can say that science maybe doesn't treat the noumenal object, but science does treat the world in ways which are universal to all agents of reason, right? Anyone who has pure reason in Kant's framework here, which is all of us, are going to understand. So science does have a universality, but the universality is dependent upon the framework of pure reason. Okay, so that in essence is, I guess that's it. So that's all I really wanted to sort of explore with you. Here, I'll show this up here, right? And this is synthetic a priori includes those of the natural sciences and mathematics which deduce the principles of experience. So you can say here that science is protected. There is a way for us to trust that science can give us knowledge about the world and our experience in the world. We need not accept the sort of skepticism of David Hume. Okay? Thank you guys for watching the video. I hope that this video helps you understand Kant here. But again, there's no substitute for reading Kant himself. And you're going to find when you do read him that he's very technical and very precise. But as a result, it actually makes it a successful investigation. So it's great stuff. So thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys online. Okay? Bye.